The roar of water echoed through Wildcat Canyon as Grace Wilson's desperate scream was swallowed by the thundering deluge. The year was 1878, and what had begun as a pleasant spring day in Wyoming Territory had transformed into a nightmare of churning water and certain death. Grace had come west only 3 months prior, leaving behind a comfortable but stifling life in Boston to accept a teaching position in Medicine Bow. At 22, she'd craved adventure and independence, qualities her father had grudgingly admitted she possessed in abundance. But as the wall of muddy water rushed toward her, Grace realized that adventure might cost her everything. She'd ventured into the canyon that morning to sketch the wildflowers that bloomed in vibrant patches among the rocks. The locals had warned her about flash floods, but the clear blue sky had betrayed no hint of danger. Now, as the distant storm's runoff surged through the narrow passage, Grace scrambled desperately up the slick canyon wall, her sodden skirts hampering every movement. "Help!" She cried again, though she knew it was futile. The nearest ranch was miles away, and no one knew where she'd gone. The water rose rapidly, already swirling around her ankles as she clung to a jutting rock. That's when she heard it, the thundering of hooves against stone, somehow cutting through the roar of the flood. Grace turned her head and saw a rider appear at the canyon's edge above her, silhouetted against the sun. "Hold on!" the man shouted, dismounting in one fluid motion. He moved with the assured grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle, quickly securing his horse and assessing the situation. Grace watched as he uncoiled a lariat from his saddle. "The water's rising fast," she called, fighting to keep the panic from her voice. "I see it," he replied, his tone calm yet urgent. "When I toss this rope, you need to grab it and hold tight. I'll pull you up." He positioned himself on a stable outcropping. "Ready!" The rope snaked down toward her. Grace reached for it, but a surge of water knocked her off balance. She slipped, plunging knee-deep into the churning current. A scream tore from her throat as the force of the water threatened to drag her away. "I can't reach it," she cried, clinging desperately to her precarious handhold. Without hesitation, the cowboy secured the rope and began making his way down the canyon wall. Grace marveled at his sure-footed descent, even as terror clawed at her chest. The water continued to rise, now reaching her waist, each second bringing her closer to being swept away. The stranger reached her just as her fingers began to slip from the rock. His strong hand grasped her wrist, and for the first time, Grace looked into his face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of the Wyoming sky. "I've got you," he said firmly. "Can you wrap your arms around my neck?" Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As she clung to him, she felt the solid strength of his shoulders beneath his worn denim shirt. He smelled of leather, horses, and sun-warmed sage. "Hold tight," he instructed, and began the treacherous climb back up, supporting her weight while finding footholds in the slippery rock. Below them, the floodwaters surged higher, swallowing the spot where Grace had stood moments before. By the time they reached the canyon rim, Grace was shaking uncontrollably, both from cold and from the realization of how close she'd come to death. The cowboy helped her onto solid ground, then quickly checked his horse, which stood patiently nearby. "Thank you," Grace managed, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "You'd have been carried downstream with everything else that canyon's claiming today," he replied bluntly, though his expression softened as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "Name's Hayes Thornton. I was checking fence lines when I heard someone calling." "Grace Wilson," she replied, extending a trembling hand. "I'm the new schoolteacher in Medicine Bow." Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable as he took her hand briefly. Schoolteacher. That explains why you weren't raised with enough sense to watch for flood signs in canyon country. Grace flushed, embarrassment and indignation warring within her. The sky was perfectly clear when I entered the canyon. Storms 30 miles away can send water through these passages, he explained, less judgmental now. You don't need to see clouds to be in danger. He glanced at the canyon, where the water continued to rise. We need to get you somewhere warm and dry. My ranch is closer than town. Grace hesitated, aware of the impropriety of visiting a bachelor's home alone. But her clothes were soaked through, and the spring air held a chill that was already seeping into her bones. Hayes seemed to read her thoughts. My housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, will be there. She'll get you fixed up with dry clothes. He untied his slicker from behind the saddle and handed it to her. Put this on for now. The oilskin coat was warm from the sun and smelled like its owner. Grace wrapped it around her shoulders gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Hayes, he corrected, helping her mount his horse. He swung up behind her, his chest a solid presence against her back as he reached around her for the reins. Hold on, Miss Wilson. The rocking tee isn't far. As they rode, Grace became intensely aware of the man behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the careful way he guided the horse over the uneven terrain, the protective arm that occasionally steadied her when the trail grew rough. Despite her ordeal, she found herself noticing the clean line of his jaw when she glanced back at him, the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his light brown hair. Hayes Thornton was nothing like the refined Boston gentleman she'd known. His hands were calloused, his face tanned by countless days in the saddle. But there was something compelling about his quiet competence, the way he'd risked his own safety without hesitation to save a stranger. There it is, Hayes said, interrupting her thoughts as they crested a rise. Below them lay a well-kept ranch, not ostentatious, but substantial. A main house built of timber and local stone stood near a large barn and several outbuildings. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and smoke curled from the house's chimney, promising warmth within. It's lovely, Grace said sincerely, seeing the care that had gone into establishing this home in such rugged country. Been in my family for 15 years, Hayes replied, a note of pride in his voice. My father brought us west when I was 14, built it up from nothing. He guided the horse down toward the ranch yard. I took over when he passed 5 years back. As they approached, a stout woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She raised a hand to shade her eyes, then hurried toward them when she recognized Hayes. What's happened? She called, concern evident in her voice. Mrs. Abernathy, this is Miss Wilson, Medicine Bow's new schoolteacher, Hayes said as he dismounted and helped Grace down. She had a run-in with the flash flood in Wildcat Canyon. She needs dry clothes and something warm to drink. The housekeeper's expression moved quickly from surprise to motherly concern. Lord have mercy, child. Come inside this minute before you catch your death. She ushered Grace toward the house, already planning aloud. I'll draw a hot bath and find you something to wear. Mr. Hayes's sister left some dresses when she moved to Cheyenne after her wedding. Should be close to your size. Hayes handed the reins to a ranch hand who'd appeared from the barn. I'll be in shortly. Need to check if any stock got caught in the lowlands when that water came through. Grace turned back. Mr. Thornton, Hayes, thank you again. I truly don't know how to repay you. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps amusement, perhaps something warmer. No repayment necessary, Miss Wilson. Just perhaps consider taking a local guide next time you go exploring. Before she could reply, Mrs. Abernathy had swept her into the house, clucking with concern as she helped Grace out of her sodden clothes and into a steaming bath that seemed like heaven after her ordeal. The housekeeper provided a simple but well-made dress that indeed fit Grace passably well, then insisted she sit by the fire with a cup of hot tea fortified with a splash of whiskey for medicinal purposes. By the time Hayes returned, Grace was feeling remarkably recovered, though the reality of how close she'd come to drowning occasionally sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Feeling better?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Much, thank you." Grace smiled, suddenly self-conscious in the borrowed dress. "Your housekeeper has been wonderfully kind." Hayes nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Abernathy. "She's been with us since we came west, more family than employee at this point." He settled into a chair opposite Grace. "I checked the canyon. Water's still high, but no cattle lost, thankfully." "I'm relieved to hear that," Grace said. "I'd hate to think my foolishness caused you any further trouble." Hayes studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "What brought you out to the canyon alone, Miss Wilson?" Grace felt her cheeks warm under his direct gaze. "I wanted to sketch the wildflowers. I've been documenting the local flora since I arrived. It's so different from what grows back east." She gestured to her satchel, which Mrs. Abernathy had hung near the fire to dry. "My sketchbook is probably ruined now." Hayes rose and retrieved the satchel, carefully extracting the sodden book. He turned the pages gently, revealing waterlogged but still discernible drawings of prairie flowers, grasses, and rock formations. "These are good," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "You have talent, Miss Wilson." "Thank you," Grace replied, surprised by his interest. "And please call me Grace. After pulling me from a flash flood, I think we can dispense with formalities." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Grace, then." He continued examining the drawings. "You've captured the Indian paintbrush perfectly. Not many take the time to notice the details of things that grow out here." "The West has a beauty all its own," she said earnestly. "Different from New England, but no less magnificent. I want to understand it better." Hayes looked up at her, something warming in his expression. "Most Easterners who come out here just see emptiness and hardship." "Oh, there's hardship aplenty," Grace admitted with a small laugh. "My students informed me on my first day that I talk funny, my clothes are impractical, and I don't know the first thing about breaking a horse, but they're not wrong about any of that." Hayes chuckled, a rich sound that Grace found herself wanting to hear again. "Kids out here learn to be direct." He handed the sketchbook back. "Some of these might be salvageable if you dry them carefully." Their conversation was interrupted as the front door swung open and a young man entered, his expression urgent. "Hayes, Porter's riding in with news. Looks like the flood took out the bridge on Miller's Creek. Town's going to be cut off until it's rebuilt." Hayes stood immediately. "Thanks, Charlie. Tell Porter I'll be right out." He turned to Grace. "This complicates getting you back to town." Grace's heart sank. Medicine Bow lay on the far side of Miller's Creek from the Thornton Ranch. "How long will repairs take?" "Depends on the damage, but at least several days," Hayes replied, running a hand through his hair. "And with the creek running high, it's not safe to ford." Mrs. Abernathy bustled in from the kitchen, having overheard the news. "Well, it's settled then. Miss Wilson will stay with us until the bridge is repaired. I'll make up the guest room." "I couldn't impose," Grace protested, though she wasn't sure what alternatives existed. "It's no imposition," Hayes said firmly, "and it's the only sensible option, unless you fancy swimming across a flooded creek." The housekeeper nodded decisively. "That's settled then. Now, Mr. Hayes, you go see to that bridge business and I'll show Miss Wilson to her room." After Hayes departed, Mrs. Abernathy led Grace upstairs to a pleasant bedroom with simple but comfortable furnishings. "Been a while since we've had a lady staying here." the older woman commented as she laid fresh towels on the dresser. Not since Mr. Hayes's sister married and moved away last year. You've been with the family a long time, Grace asked, curious about her rescuer. Since they came west, Mrs. Abernathy confirmed, plumping a pillow. Watched Mr. Hayes grow from a gangly boy into the man he is today. She paused, giving Grace an appraising look. He's a good man, Miss Wilson, best rancher in the county, fair to his workers, generous when folks need help. She smoothed the quilt with practiced hands. Not much for social gatherings, though. Keeps to himself mostly, especially since his father passed. Grace absorbed this information, intrigued despite herself. He mentioned his sister married and moved to Cheyenne. Yes, married the banker's son. Left Hayes here alone, though he'd never complain about it. Mrs. Abernathy moved to the window, adjusting the curtain. Ranch this size needs a woman's touch, if you ask me, but he's never seemed inclined to court any of the local girls. She glanced back at Grace. Dinner's at 6. Kitchen's downstairs if you need anything before then. After the housekeeper left, Grace moved to the window, which offered a view of the ranch yard. Below, she could see Hayes conferring with several men, his posture conveying authority without arrogance. He gestured toward the distant hills, presumably discussing the flood damage, then patted one of the men reassuringly on the shoulder. There was something compelling about Hayes Thornton, she had to admit. Not just his physical appearance, though he was certainly handsome in a rugged, unpolished way. It was more his quiet confidence, the evident respect his men showed him, the way he'd risked himself without hesitation to save a stranger. Grace turned from the window, reminding herself that she had come west to teach, not to be distracted by handsome ranchers. Still, as she settled onto the bed to rest after her ordeal, her thoughts kept returning to the moment when Hayes had grasped her hand and pulled her from the rising waters. The next few days established an unexpected rhythm to Grace's life at the rocking T. Each morning, she'd wake to the sounds of the ranch coming alive, roosters crowing, men calling to one another as they headed out for the day's work, the distant lowing of cattle. After breakfast, during which Hayes was unfailingly polite but somewhat reserved, he would ride out to oversee the bridge repairs or attend to ranch business. Grace, determined not to be idle, offered to help Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks. The housekeeper initially protested that a guest shouldn't work, but soon appreciated having another pair of hands. They fell into easy conversation as they kneaded bread dough or hung laundry, and Grace found herself learning as much about Western life from Mrs. Abernathy as she ever had from books. On the third afternoon of her stay, Grace was sitting on the front porch, attempting to salvage some of her sketches by carefully separating the damp pages, when Hayes returned earlier than usual. "Any luck?" he asked, nodding toward the sketchbook as he took a seat in the rocking chair beside her. "Some," Grace admitted, showing him a drawing of columbines that had survived reasonably intact. "I'm afraid many are beyond recovery, though." Hayes studied the drawing with genuine interest. "You'll just have to make new ones." "I suppose I will," Grace agreed, though perhaps with a better awareness of flash flood dangers. A smile tugged at his lips. "I could show you some safe places for sketching if you'd like. The ranch has some spots that rival anything in Wildcat Canyon." Grace looked up in surprise. "That's very kind of you, but I know you're busy with the bridge repairs and ranch work. Bridge crew has things well in hand. Should be passable by tomorrow afternoon." Was there a note of regret in his voice? "As for ranch work, even a foreman deserves an hour off now and then." "In that case, I'd love to see more of your land," Grace said, surprised by how much the prospect pleased her. They set out an hour later, Grace riding a gentle mare that Hayes assured her was steady as a rocking chair. He led them along a stream that meandered through rocking tea property, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the ranch's early days. Grace found herself captivated not just by the landscape, but by the animated way Hayes described it, so different from his usual reserved manner. They stopped at a small rise overlooking a meadow bursting with late spring wildflowers. A stand of cottonwoods provided welcome shade, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. "This is breathtaking," Grace said as Hayes helped her dismount. "May I sketch here?" "That's why I brought you," he replied, tethering the horses in the shade. He spread a blanket on the grass and gestured for her to make herself comfortable. Grace settled down and opened her partially salvaged sketchbook to a dry page. As she began to draw the scene before her, she was acutely aware of Hayes sitting nearby, his back against a tree trunk, hat pulled low over his eyes. "Have you always wanted to be a teacher?" he asked after a comfortable silence. Grace considered the question as her pencil traced the outline of a particularly vibrant patch of flowers. "I've always loved learning, and sharing knowledge seemed a natural extension of that. Teaching gives me a purpose, a way to contribute." She glanced up at him. "What about you?" "Did you always know you'd run the ranch?" Hayes shifted, his expression thoughtful. "I fought against it at first, believe it or not. Wanted to see more of the world than Wyoming Territory, even talked about joining the army for a while." This surprised her. "What changed your mind?" "My father took ill when I was 19. Came down with pneumonia one winter. I had to take over most of the operations." He plucked a stem of grass, twisting it between his fingers. "By the time he recovered, I'd realized something important: this land gets in your blood. The responsibility of it, the freedom of it." He gestured to the vista spread before them. "Couldn't imagine leaving it behind." Grace nodded, understanding. "It's beautiful in a way I never expected the West to be. The books I read back in Boston described a harsh, unforgiving wilderness." "It can be that too," Hayes acknowledged. "Winter blizzards that freeze cattle where they stand, drought that cracks the earth and dries up streams, but there's a rightness to it even in its harshness." He looked at her directly. "It's honest. The land doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is." "Unlike people," Grace suggested, sensing something deeper in his words. A rueful smile touched his lips. "Maybe. Back east I always felt like everyone was playing a part. Out here, a man stands or falls on his own merits, not his family name or how well he can navigate social niceties." Grace set down her pencil, considering his words. "There's truth in that, though perhaps it's not quite so black and white. I've known genuine people in Boston, and I'm sure there are those who wear masks even in Wyoming." Hayes nodded, acknowledging her point. "Fair enough. But out here, the masks tend to slip sooner. Hard to maintain pretenses when you're working side by side in a blizzard or fighting a prairie fire." They fell into easy conversation after that, discovering shared interests in books and music that surprised them both. Hayes admitted to having a small but cherished collection of volumes inherited from his mother, and Grace confessed that while she loved teaching, she sometimes missed the libraries and bookshops of Boston. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting the landscape in golden light, Hayes reluctantly suggested they head back to the ranch house. Grace carefully packed away her sketching materials, having filled several pages with drawings of the meadow and its wildflowers. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said as he helped her mount. "It was exactly what I needed." Hayes's hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. "My pleasure, Grace." The ride back was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. Grace found herself wondering what would happen once the bridge was repaired, and she returned to town. Would she see Hayes again? Medicine Bow wasn't large, but their paths hadn't crossed before her misadventure in the canyon. Her musings were interrupted as they approached the ranch house and saw a wagon in the yard. A woman in a fashionable traveling costume was speaking animatedly with Mrs. Abernathy on the porch. "Who's that?" Grace asked, noting how Hayes had straightened in the saddle, his expression suddenly guarded. "Looks like Vivian Parker," he replied, a note of resignation in his voice. "Daughter of the banker in Medicine Bow, must have come over on horseback since the bridge is out." As they rode into the yard, the woman turned, her face lighting up at the sight of Hayes. "There you are. I was so worried when I heard about the flood. Father said your land was right in its path." Hayes dismounted and helped Grace down before turning to address the visitor. "Vivian, this is unexpected. The ranch is fine, though we did lose some fencing." "Thank goodness," Vivian said, moving forward to place a proprietary hand on Hayes's arm. Her eyes flicked to Grace, assessing and slightly wary. "And who might this be?" "Miss Grace Wilson, Medicine Bow's new schoolteacher," Hayes introduced her. "She was caught in Wildcat Canyon during the flash flood. I happened to be nearby." Understanding dawned on Vivian's face, though her smile remained fixed. "How fortunate for Miss Wilson." "We've heard about your heroics in town, Hayes." She turned to Grace. "He's always been our local hero, hasn't he, Mrs. Abernathy?" The housekeeper nodded noncommittally, her expression revealing nothing. "Miss Wilson has been staying with us until the bridge is repaired," Hayes explained, subtly disengaging himself from Vivian's grip to help Grace with her horse. "I see," Vivian replied, her tone suggesting she saw perhaps more than was there. "Well, I've come to invite you to dinner at our house once the bridge is passable. Father is gathering some of the ranchers to discuss the recent rustling problems near the territorial border." "I appreciate the invitation," Hayes said politely. "If you'll excuse me, I need to see to the horses." He nodded to both women and led the animals toward the barn. Vivian watched him go, then turned to Grace with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hayes is a wonderful man, isn't he? So dedicated to his ranch. I've known him since we were children." Grace nodded, uncertain how to respond to the clear territorial marking in the other woman's tone. "He's been very kind to offer me shelter after my mishap." "Yes, that's Hayes, always the gentleman." Vivian adjusted her gloves. "I should be going. The ride back will take longer with the bridge out." She turned to Mrs. Abernathy. "Please remind Hayes about dinner. Tuesday next week." After she'd departed, riding side saddle on a fine bay horse, Grace helped Mrs. Abernathy prepare the evening meal in thoughtful silence. "Miss Parker seems very fond of Mr. Thornton," she ventured finally as they kneaded dough for biscuits. The housekeeper made a noncommittal noise. "The Parker family has had their eye on the rocking tea for years. Old Mr. Parker thinks joining their bank money with Thornton land would make a fine match." She cut the dough with practiced efficiency. "But it takes two to make a marriage, and Mr. Hayes has never shown much interest in that direction, for all her efforts." Grace absorbed this information, telling herself that the relief she felt was simply because Vivian Parker had seemed rather cold and calculating, not at all the sort of person who would appreciate Hayes's straightforward nature and quiet depth. That evening at dinner, Hayes was quieter than usual, responding to Grace's attempts at conversation with polite but brief answers. Finally, as Mrs. Abernathy cleared away the plates, Grace decided directness was required. "Have I offended you somehow, Mr. Thornton?" she asked. Hayes looked up, startled. "Of course not. Why would you think that?" "You've barely spoken 10 words since we sat down," Grace pointed out. "If it's about Miss Parker's visit, it's not," he interrupted, then sighed. "Not entirely, anyway. Vivian has expectations that I've never encouraged." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "The bridge should be passable tomorrow afternoon. I imagine you'll be glad to get back to town and your students." Grace felt a sudden hollowness in her chest at the thought. "Yes, of course," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "Though I must say my stay here has been unexpectedly pleasant, despite the circumstances that brought me." Something softened in Hayes's expression. "I'm glad to hear that." He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps you might come back sometime. To sketch, I mean. That meadow has different flowers through the seasons." "I'd like that," Grace replied, warmth spreading through her at the invitation. The next morning brought news that the bridge was indeed nearly repaired. By early afternoon, Hayes was helping Grace into the wagon that would take her back to Medicine Bow, her few belongings packed neatly beside her. "Thank you again for everything," Grace said, suddenly reluctant to leave. "Not just the rescue, but your hospitality these past days." Hayes nodded, his hand lingering on the wagon's side. "It was no hardship having you here, Grace." He seemed about to say more, but instead stepped back, gesturing to the ranch hand who would drive her. "Tom will see you safely to town." The journey back to Medicine Bow gave Grace time to reflect on the strange turn her life had taken. What had begun as a near tragedy had evolved into something unexpected, a glimpse into a different kind of life, and an undeniable attraction to a man unlike any she'd known before. News of her adventure had preceded her to town, and Grace found herself the center of attention as she returned to her small rooms above the mercantile. Mrs. Fleming, the mercantile owner's wife, insisted on hearing every detail, though she seemed more interested in Hayes's role than in the flood itself. "Hayes Thornton is quite a catch," Mrs. Fleming observed meaningfully after Grace described her rescue. "One of the most successful ranchers in the county, and not hard on the eyes either. Half the unmarried women in 3 counties have set their caps for him, but he keeps to himself mostly." "He was very kind," Grace replied neutrally, unwilling to feed the town's evident appetite for gossip. "Vivian Parker has been after him for years," Mrs. Fleming continued, oblivious to Grace's discomfort. "Her father practically throws them together at every opportunity. But if Hayes was to finally settle down, the rocking T could use a sensible woman like yourself." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Fleming, I assure you, Mr. Thornton simply offered assistance to someone in need, as any decent person would." The older woman smiled knowingly. "Of course, dear. Now you must be tired after your ordeal. Your students have been asking after you. School reopens tomorrow, I presume." The return to teaching provided a welcome distraction from Grace's confused feelings. Her students were full of questions about the flood and her stay at the Thornton Ranch, which she answered as briefly as possible while redirecting their attention to arithmetic and geography. 2 weeks passed with no word from Hayes, though Grace found her thoughts drifting to him often. She wondered if their connection had been a product of extraordinary circumstances rather than anything more meaningful. Perhaps in the normal rhythm of their separate lives, there was no place for the understanding that had grown between them during those few days. Then one Saturday morning, as Grace was selecting vegetables at the mercantile, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Hayes stood hesitantly at the entrance, hat in hand, looking both determined and uncertain. "Miss Wilson," he greeted her formally, aware of Mrs. Fleming's interested gaze from behind the counter. "Mr. Thornton," Grace replied, her heart quickening. "What brings you to town?" "Business at the bank," he said, then added more quietly, "and I was hoping to speak with you if you have a moment." Grace nodded, setting down the potatoes she'd been examining. "Of course." They stepped outside onto the boardwalk, acutely aware of curious eyes following them. "Would you care to take a walk?" Hayes suggested, gesturing down the street. They strolled in silence for a moment, Hayes seemingly gathering his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about your interest in local flora. There's to be a social at the Grange Hall next Saturday. Afterward, if the weather holds, some folks are planning a picnic out at Cottonwood Creek. There are some unusual flowers blooming there this time of year." He cleared his throat. "I wondered if you might like to attend. With me." Grace felt a smile spreading across her face. "I would like that very much." Relief washed over Hayes's features. "Good, that's good." He glanced back toward the mercantile, where several faces had appeared at the window. "I should let you get back to your shopping. May I call on you next Saturday at 2 o'clock? "I'll look forward to it," Grace replied, warmed by the genuine pleasure in his eyes. The week that followed passed with excruciating slowness for Grace. She found herself selecting her attire for the social with unusual care, and wondering what the other townspeople would make of her attending with Hayes. Vivian Parker's displeasure was a certainty, but Grace discovered she couldn't bring herself to care over much about that. When Saturday finally arrived, Grace was ready half an hour before Hayes was due to arrive. She had chosen a dress of pale blue that complemented her eyes, with just enough fashionable detail to be appropriate for a social without appearing overdressed. Her hair, usually confined in a practical knot for teaching, she wore partially down, soft waves framing her face. The knock at her door came precisely at 2. When she opened it, the appreciation in Hayes's eyes made her glad of the extra care she'd taken with her appearance. He too had dressed for the occasion, wearing a clean black suit that, while not the latest fashion, fit his broad shoulders perfectly. "You look beautiful, Grace," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You're quite handsome yourself." The social was a typical small-town affair, a fiddle band playing lively tunes, tables laden with home-cooked dishes, and nearly everyone from Medicine Bow and the surrounding ranches in attendance. Grace noticed the curious glances as she and Hayes entered together, and the frankly disapproving look from Vivian Parker, who stood with her father near the punch bowl. "People are staring," Grace murmured as Hayes led her toward the refreshment table. "Let them," he replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. "I've given them plenty to talk about over the years by not socializing much. Might as well give them something new to discuss." His obvious unconcern for gossip made Grace laugh, releasing some of her tension. The afternoon passed pleasantly, with Hayes introducing her to ranchers and their families she hadn't yet met through her teaching. When the band struck up a waltz, Hayes hesitated, then extended his hand. "I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted, "but I'd like to try if you're willing." Grace placed her hand in his, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers. "I'd be delighted." Hayes proved more graceful than he'd claimed, guiding her confidently through the waltz. Grace was acutely aware of his hand at her waist, the clean scent of soap and leather that accompanied him, the warmth in his blue eyes as he looked down at her. "You dance very well for someone who claims no skill," she observed. A smile tugged at his lips. "My mother insisted I learn the basics. Said no son of hers would embarrass her at social functions, even in Wyoming Territory." His expression grew wistful. "She loved music and dancing. The piano in our parlor was hers. My father hauled it all the way from St. Louis by wagon train as a wedding gift." "That's a remarkable gesture of love," Grace said softly, touched by the story. "Yes, it was," Hayes agreed. "My father was a hard man, in many ways had to be, to build a ranch from nothing, but he loved her completely." The music drew to a close and they stepped apart, though Hayes kept her hand in his. "The picnic should be starting soon. Shall we join the others?" The picnic site at Cottonwood Creek was indeed beautiful, with ancient trees providing shade along the burbling stream. Families spread blankets on the grass, while children played tag among the trees and young couples strolled along the water's edge. Hayes led Grace to a quieter spot a little distance from the main group. "I thought you might like some piece to sketch," he explained, spreading a blanket and setting down the basket Mrs. Abernathy had packed for them. Grace settled onto the blanket, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You remembered my sketchbook," she said, noticing he'd brought along the new one he'd given her before she left the ranch, a parting gift she treasured. "I remember everything about those days," he replied quietly, meeting her eyes. The simple statement sent warmth coursing through her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Grace sketching the wildflowers that grew along the creek bank while Hayes pointed out different varieties and shared what he knew of their names and properties. "My mother kept a journal about plants," he explained. "She was interested in their medicinal uses. Learned from an old Shoshone woman who sometimes came to trade at the ranch." "You must miss her very much," Grace observed, noting the tenderness with which he spoke of his mother. Hayes nodded. "She understood this land in a way my father never quite managed, for all that he was determined to tame it. She saw its beauty, its rhythms." He looked at Grace's sketch. "Rather like you do." The comparison pleased her immensely. "I'm not sure I deserve that compliment, but I'm grateful for it." As the afternoon waned, other picnickers began to pack up and head back toward town. Hayes made no move to leave, however, and Grace found herself hoping they might linger as the day cooled toward evening. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," Hayes said finally, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Grace set aside her sketchbook, giving him her full attention. "Yes, these past weeks since you returned to town." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I've found myself thinking about you, often. Too often for a man who's supposed to be focusing on his ranch." Grace's heart quickened. "I've thought of you as well," she admitted softly. Hayes moved closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not a sophisticated man, Grace. I don't have pretty words or grand gestures, but I know what I feel." He took her hand gently. "I care for you more than I expected to care for anyone." "Hayes," Grace began, emotion making her voice unsteady. "Let me finish," he said quietly. "I know you came west for independence, for a teaching career. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. But I would like to court you properly, if you're willing, to see if what's growing between us might become something lasting." Grace felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved by his straightforward declaration. "I would like that very much," she whispered. "Very much indeed." His smile transformed his face, erasing the worry that had lined his brow. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Hayes leaned forward and kissed her a gentle touch of lips that held both question and promise. When they parted, Grace felt as though something fundamental had shifted, as if the world had rearranged itself around this new reality between them. "We should head back before we lose the light," Hayes said reluctantly, though he made no immediate move to stand. "Yes, I suppose we should," Grace agreed, equally reluctant. The ride back to town was filled with a new awareness, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. Hayes helped Grace down from the wagon outside her rooms, his hands lingering at her waist. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked. "Perhaps we could attend church together." Grace nodded, smiling up at him. "I'd like that." The following weeks established a pattern to their courtship. Hayes would ride into town several times a week, sometimes taking Grace for drives in the countryside, other times simply sitting with her on the small porch outside her rooms, talking as the sun set. On Saturdays, he often brought her out to the rocking tee, where Mrs. Abernathy's obvious approval warmed Grace almost as much as Hayes's attentions. Not everyone viewed their growing attachment with favor, of course. Vivian Parker made her displeasure known through cool civility whenever they encountered her, and her father seemed to find reasons to deny the Thornton Ranch credit extensions that had previously been routine. But these small shadows couldn't dim the happiness Grace found in Hayes's company. As summer progressed into early autumn, Grace found herself falling deeply in love with not only Hayes, but with the life he represented. She loved the vast openness of the ranch, so different from Boston's crowded streets. She loved the way Hayes treated his workers with respect and fairness, the gentle way he handled young colts, the quiet strength he brought to every task. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch swing at the rocking tea after Sunday dinner, Hayes took her hand in his. "Winter will be here before we know it," he observed, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "First snow usually comes by early November." Grace nodded, having heard enough about Wyoming winters to feel a mix of anticipation and trepidation. "The children are already talking about sledding and snowball fights." Hayes smiled at that, then grew serious. "Grace, I've been thinking about us." He shifted to face her more directly. "These past months have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," she said softly, meaning it completely. "I don't want them to end," Hayes continued, his voice low and fervent. "I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's. My father brought it all the way from Philadelphia before they were married." Grace's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Hayes, I love you, Grace Wilson," he said simply, his eyes reflecting the depth of his feelings. "Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Yes. Oh, yes." Hayes slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that spoke of long restraint finally released. When they parted, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I never expected this," he murmured. "When I rode out to check fence lines that day and heard someone calling for help, I never imagined I was riding toward my future." Grace smiled through her tears. "It seems I owe a debt of gratitude to that flash flood, for all that it nearly drowned me." Hayes laughed, the sound rich with joy. "Let's set a date before winter sets in," he suggested. "I don't want to wait until spring thaw to make you my wife." They were married in Medicine Bow's small church 3 weeks later, with most of the town in attendance. The bride wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Abernathy had helped alter from Hayes's sister's wedding gown, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Hayes had gathered for her that morning. As they spoke their vows, Grace thought of how far she'd come from the proper Boston girl who'd arrived in Wyoming seeking adventure and independence. She'd found those things, yes, but she'd also found something she hadn't known. She was seeking a love as vast and enduring as the western landscape itself. Winter came early that year, just as Hayes had predicted, with the first heavy snow falling a week after their wedding. But within the walls of the rocking T Ranch house, there was only warmth and happiness as Grace and Hayes began their life together. The years that followed brought changes, both expected and surprising. Grace continued teaching at the Medicine Bow School until the birth of their first child, a son they named Thomas, after Hayes's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, William, 2 years after that. The rocking T prospered under their joint stewardship. Grace's Eastern education proved unexpectedly valuable in managing the ranch's books and correspondence, while her artistic eye helped transform the ranch house into a true home, filled with beauty and comfort. Hayes expanded their holdings, breeding better stock and implementing new farming techniques. He learned from agricultural journals Grace ordered from back east. They weathered hardships, 2 blizzards that threatened their cattle, a year of drought that tested even Hayes's optimism, the loss of their 4th child shortly after birth. But through it all, they faced life's challenges together, their bond only strengthening with each passing season. On their 10th anniversary, Hayes surprised Grace with a special gift, a small studio built onto the ranch house, with windows positioned to capture the best light and views of the land she'd grown to love as deeply as he did. There, she created paintings of Wyoming's wild beauty that eventually found their way to galleries as far away as Denver and even Chicago. "Did you ever regret it?" Hayes asked her one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children playing in the yard as the sun set behind the distant mountains. "Giving up Boston for all this?" Grace leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible when she'd first ventured west. "Not for a moment," she assured him truthfully. "Every choice I made led me here, even the foolish decision to sketch in a canyon during spring runoff." Hayes laughed, wrapping his arm around her. "Then I suppose I should be grateful for your poor judgment that day." "As should I," Grace replied, turning to kiss him softly. "As should I." As twilight deepened around them, Grace Wilson Thornton reflected on the strange workings of fate that had brought her to this moment. A near tragedy had become the beginning of her greatest joy, proof that sometimes life's most treacherous currents could carry one exactly where they were meant to be all along.